sustainability topics. This week, we are so excited because we are doing our first audience Q&A episode. You guys have sent in some anonymous questions for Tad to answer. So we have a few of those to answer today. We're super excited. So the first one is, my company doesn't know what to do first. Should we do our carbon footprint benchmarking or do a life cycle assessment?
Yeah, so that's a question we get quite often. And the way I would answer this is, if you're going to do a life cycle assessment, you're going to be collecting a lot of the information that you would have to do for your carbon footprint benchmarking anyway. So what I tend to suggest to people is, if you need the life cycle, and this is what I want to qualify, many companies are like, oh, should I just do a life cycle assessment just to get an environmental product declaration? And, that's fine, but we strongly recommend companies to do life cycle assessments so they can understand the impacts of their product, the impacts from their manufacturing, the impacts of their raw materials, transportation, etc. And then they can use that information to plan out their whole decarbonization strategy as they move forward as well. They can also use it for their new product development, with their R&D teams and their folks that are working in their stage gate processes to analyze the various products and create the next generation products. So my answer would be, if you're thinking about doing both, you could do the life cycle assessment, because you're going to be collecting the scope 1 and scope 2 emission data. And just to remind everybody, scope 1 means that that's all the fuels you burn in your facility, in your operations. You're going to also be doing your scope 2, which would be all the electricity you use. So right there, you would be doing your carbon footprint benchmarking. And if you do the life cycle assessment, and let's say that you're running a life cycle assessment on the products that are manufactured, that would then give you the metric around your basically your carbon footprint benchmarking. So you would know, for every product I make, it's X kilowatt hours of electricity, it's Y MMBTU of natural gas, or the scope 1, scope 2. So then you have a metric to actually then set goals. Okay, so by doing the LCA, you're really going to be accomplishing a lot. And the beautiful thing about the LCA also, it would help you to do your scope 3 emissions, because you would then have an understanding of the impacts of the raw materials you're using, which could be a very large part of your scope 3. So my advice, do the life cycle assessment, but also in parallel, flesh out what you need to do for your carbon footprint at the same time, because you're going to be collecting the same data. And then you get multiple uses for setting your goals, driving more sustainable products, and also maybe doing some of your scope 3.
That's awesome. We love when it doesn't have to be a one or the other thing. It can be a both at the same time thing. So next question, my company is trying to understand how we should do our scope 3 analysis. Do you have any suggestions on how to approach this?
Well, the question I just answered is a great lead into this. And one thing we have to think about when you're doing scope 3 means it's all the emissions that you have some responsibility for, but you do not own. So for example, let's say you're a manufacturer of products and you're buying raw materials, or you're buying parts and you're assembling something and then selling it. All the suppliers that are sending you the raw materials or the parts, they have their own carbon footprints, basically their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for making the raw materials and parts, and then getting them over to you. So that is one thing that you have to think about. And what we do find is, anybody that manufactures anything, usually the raw materials and their suppliers are the largest part of their footprint. So that is one aspect to consider here. And like I said earlier, if you do life cycle assessment, you can definitely start to understand basically the carbon footprint of those raw materials and parts, because you would have your LCA data from the EcoInvent database or the US LCI database when you're, from the LCA software, that would allow you to estimate that. And that would probably be a big chunk of your scope 3. However, scope 3 could also be the transportation of those raw materials to your plant, because the trucks, you usually don't own the trucks that are, bringing that in, or the ships that are bringing in the materials. And then it would also be the transportation of your final product from your gate, your factory gate, out to distribution and to sale, because usually you're using a third party to do that, a supplier for that transportation service. Another aspect would be your waste that you generate. And you even though you generate the waste, you don't manage it, right? So the waste that goes to the landfill, the waste that goes to the recycling center, the compost facility, the waste to energy facility, those are all managed by somebody else. But those emissions you're responsible, because you created the waste. And other things could be employee travel, if you lease buildings, there's all kinds of different things you'd have to look at. So what I would say here is you should be looking at, first of all, you want to identify what would be the category of scope 3 that's probably most impactful. Make that assessment and try to determine, and like I said, if you're a manufacturer, it's probably going to be your raw materials and those transportations I just mentioned. Depending on what you manufacture, could be waste also. So those would be great places to start. Start looking at what are the categories that are most relevant to you. And then in many cases, there's not a perfect science for doing scope 3. So there'd be a lot of estimating and calculations. And there are methodologies you can follow on how to do the calculations and whatnot that are accepted practice. So that would be my recommendation on how to approach scope 3.